American consumers are spending more money while feeling worse about the economy than they have in months. The retail sales data just revealed a disturbing paradox that exposes how Trump's trade policies are creating panic buying that could trigger the recession everyone's trying to avoid. Let's begin. If you stayed with us through that opening, you're already ahead of most analysts who are celebrating retail sales without understanding the psychology driving them. You now understand that this isn't just about consumer strength. This is about fear-driven spending that reveals deep anxiety about what's coming next. The Commerce Department reported retail sales rose 0.5% in July, with June revised upward to 0.9%. On the surface, this looks healthy, but the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Survey dropped to a three-month low of 57.2, down from 61.8 in July. Americans are spending more while feeling worse about their economic prospects. The sectoral breakdown reveals strategic spending. Furniture stores saw strong gains as shoppers tried to beat tariff impacts. Auto sales rose 1.6%. As Americans rushed to avoid the 25% duty on imported cars. This isn't normal consumer behavior. This is hoarding driven by economic anxiety. Most revealing is what happened to inflation expectations. Consumers now expect prices to increase 4.9% in the next year, up from 4.4% in July and dramatically higher than 2.8% at year-end. Americans aren't just worried about inflation, they're preparing for it by accelerating purchases. Electronic sales were down, and restaurant spending fell as consumers prioritized essential purchases and ate at home to save money. Underneath the headline numbers, Americans are making defensive financial choices that indicate real concern about their economic future. You've now grasped how trade policies create economic anxiety that drives counterproductive consumer behavior. But what you're about to discover is how this panic buying pattern is creating exactly the inflationary pressures that make recession more likely. By staying with this analysis, you've positioned yourself to understand the accelerating dynamics that caught economic officials unprepared. You now see how consumer sentiment collapse is combining with fear-driven spending to create market distortions that could trigger the economic problems everyone's trying to avoid. The transformation from normal consumer behavior to panic buying accelerated when Americans began connecting tariff announcements to immediate price impacts. Rather than gradual adjustment, consumers started front-loading purchases in ways that create demand spikes and supply chain stress. Economists at RSM noted difficulty attributing July's gains to resilient spending given tariff uncertainty. A sizable portion likely came from rising import prices and consumers pulling forward spending ahead of August tariff deadlines. The furniture sales surge exemplifies this pattern. Americans aren't buying because they feel confident. They're buying because they expect furniture to become unaffordable. Auto sales data shows the same pattern. After surging in March and April to beat tariff implementation, sales slumped, then recovered in July as new tariff threats emerged. This volatility makes planning impossible for manufacturers while creating inventory problems throughout supply chains. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible situation as this behavior creates conflicting signals. Strong retail sales suggest the economy can handle higher rates, but collapsing sentiment and rising inflation expectations suggest cuts might be needed to prevent recession. Wholesale inflation data showed prices surging 0.9% in July, the biggest jump in 3 years. This suggests businesses are passing tariff costs to consumers, validating the inflation fears driving panic buying. The feedback loop between tariff anxiety and actual price increases is becoming self-reinforcing. You've now uncovered how trade policy uncertainty creates consumer behavior that amplifies rather than cushions economic disruption. But what happened next revealed that this spending pattern is creating exactly the economic instability that recession predictions are based on. If you're liking the video so far, make sure to subscribe. Having stayed committed to understanding this story, you've earned access to the explosive details that economic analysts are only now processing. You can finally see what others missed: the moment when consumer anxiety transformed from market concern into economic reality that threatens to trigger recession scenarios. The crisis peaked when sentiment data revealed consumer confidence had fallen to levels not seen since spring trade war anxiety. The 57.2 reading represented fundamental loss of confidence in economic stability that changes how Americans make financial decisions. The inflation expectation surge from 2.8% to 4.9% in 8 months documented a psychological shift that makes recession more likely, regardless of current fundamentals. When consumers expect significant inflation, they modify spending and saving behavior in ways that create the very problems they're trying to protect against. But the most shocking revelation was how retailers and economists struggled to interpret spending spending data showing strong sales driven by fear rather than confidence. Traditional models assume increased spending reflects optimism about future income. When spending increases while sentiment collapses, it suggests crisis psychology rather than economic health. Major retailers began reporting that purchasing patterns had shifted toward front-loading and stockpiling that creates operational challenges. Inventory management becomes impossible when demand spikes are driven by tariff avoidance rather than actual need. Labor market data reinforced concerns as July job growth of only 73,000 fell well short of 115,000 expected. The combination of slowing hiring, rising inflation expectations, and anxiety-driven spending creates exactly the stagflation scenario policymakers have been trying to avoid since the 1970s. The Federal Reserve found itself facing impossible policy choices as traditional economic relationships broke down. Consumer spending suggested the economy could handle restrictive policy, but sentiment data suggested accommodation might be needed to prevent confidence collapse from becoming reality. You now understand how trade policy uncertainty can create psychological conditions that make recession more likely, regardless of current fundamentals. But what you're about to learn is how this consumer anxiety is creating long-term changes in American economic behavior. By continuing through this analysis, you've gained insight into immediate responses that consumer sentiment collapse triggered across economic institutions. You now see how fear-driven spending is creating market distortions that reveal fundamental problems with current economic management approaches. Federal Reserve officials began emergency consultations to understand how collapsing confidence could coexist with strong spending. Traditional models don't account for sustained spending driven by inflation fear rather than income confidence, making monetary policy decisions potentially counterproductive. Corporate executives reported that consumer behavior had become unpredictable as purchasing decisions were driven by tariff timing rather than actual need. This makes inventory planning, production scheduling, and revenue forecasting nearly impossible for businesses trying to maintain stability. Retailers accelerated plans to raise prices as they recognized that consumer willingness to front-load purchases provided opportunities to pass through tariff costs without immediately losing market share. Financial analysts began questioning whether current market valuations reflect economic reality or artificial demand driven by policy uncertainty. When spending is motivated by fear rather than confidence, it suggests underlying weakness that traditional metrics might not capture. You've now witnessed how consumer psychology can create economic conditions that make traditional policy tools ineffective. But what you're about to discover is how this anxiety-driven spending pattern is creating permanent changes in American economic relationships. Having followed this analysis to its conclusion, you now understand what economic policymakers are only beginning to recognize. This isn't temporary consumer adjustment that will normalize when trade policies stabilize. You've gained insight into how sustained policy uncertainty can permanently alter consumer behavior in ways that make economic management more difficult. The consumer sentiment collapse while retail sales remain strong indicates that Americans have lost confidence in economic stability while still having financial capacity to make purchases. This suggests that recession, when it comes, could be rapid and severe, as psychological conditions are already in place for confidence collapse to become spending collapse. The shift in inflation expectations represents institutionalized anxiety that changes how Americans approach major financial decisions. When consumers expect sustained inflation, they modify savings, investment, and purchasing behavior in ways that can create the very inflation they're trying to protect against. The Federal Reserve faces long-term challenges as traditional relationships between consumer sentiment, spending, and economic performance break down under sustained policy uncertainty. Monetary policy tools designed for predictable consumer behavior become less effective when psychological factors override traditional economic incentives. Financial markets must price in permanent changes to consumer behavior that make economic forecasting more difficult and recession more likely. The breakdown of traditional relationships between economic indicators creates systematic uncertainty that affects everything from corporate planning to investment strategy. You now possess complete understanding of how trade policy uncertainty can create consumer psychology that makes recession more likely while creating the appearance of economic strength. American consumer anxiety isn't just market sentiment. It's evidence of how sustained policy uncertainty can create economic instability. The next phase will likely see continued divergence between surface economic indicators and underlying consumer psychology until something forces resolution between fear-driven spending and economic reality. The next big story that you missed today is how the S&P 500 just hit record highs, while Bank of America revealed a terrifying chart showing stock valuations have surpassed dot-com bubble levels, with one strategist warning it better be different this time. If you caught that opening and stayed, you're already seeing what most investors are celebrating without understanding the danger signals flashing red beneath the the surface. You now understand that this isn't just about new market records, this is about valuations reaching levels that historically precede devastating crashes. Bank of America strategist Michael Hartnett just shared a chart that should terrify anyone with money in the stock market. The S&P 500's price-to-book ratio has reached a record high of 5.3, surpassing the 5.1 level seen in March 2000 at the peak of the dot-com bubble. The warning signs don't stop there. The S&P 500's forward price-to-earnings ratio is at the highest level since the dot-com era. Meanwhile, the Shiller cyclically adjusted price-to-earnings ratio is at similar levels to 1929, 2000, and 2021, three periods that preceded major market corrections. AI optimism is driving this valuation surge as investors convince themselves that artificial intelligence will transform the economy in ways that justify paying any price for stocks. Hartnett's response was blunt: it better be different this time. You've now grasped how AI euphoria is creating valuation levels that historically end in disaster. But what you're about to discover is how multiple warning signs are converging to suggest that this bubble could be even more dangerous than previous market mania. By staying with this analysis, you've positioned yourself to understand the accelerating dynamics that most investors are completely ignoring. You now see how AI bubble valuations are combining with economic uncertainty to create conditions that could trigger a market crash worse than anything we've seen since 2008. The transformation from reasonable AI optimism to dangerous bubble mentality accelerated when investors began justifying any valuation level by pointing to potential future earnings that may never materialize. This is exactly the same psychology that drove the dot-com bubble. The difference this time is that AI companies are already showing profits, which gives investors false confidence. But profitability doesn't justify infinite valuations, and current AI earnings don't support the massive premium investors are paying for future growth that may not materialize. Consumer sentiment data showing Americans worried about inflation and unemployment while stock markets hit records creates a disconnect that historically precedes major corrections. When Wall Street celebrates while Main Street worries, it usually means financial markets have lost touch with economic reality. You've now uncovered how AI euphoria is creating exactly the kind of dangerous market conditions that precede major crashes. But what happened next revealed that smart money is already positioning for the bubble to burst. Having stayed committed to understanding this story completely, you've earned access to the explosive details that most investors are missing while they chase AI stocks higher. You can finally see what others can't: the exact moment when record highs became a warning signal rather than a reason to celebrate. The crisis became apparent when Hartnett's charts revealed that three separate valuation measures had reached levels associated with major market tops. The price-to-book ratio exceeding dot-com levels, forward PE ratios near historical peaks, and Shiller ratios matching 1929 and 2000 creates a convergence of warning signals. The psychology driving this bubble became clear when investors continued buying stocks despite overwhelming evidence that valuations had reached dangerous levels. This is exactly the mentality that characterizes bubble peaks when rational analysis is abandoned in favor of momentum chasing. Smart money began positioning for correction as Hartnett recommended bonds and non-US stocks as beneficiaries when the bubble bursts. The fact that professional strategists are preparing for market decline while retail investors chase new highs creates exactly the conditions that trigger major sell-offs. You now understand how AI euphoria has created market conditions that make a major correction almost inevitable. But what you're about to learn is how this bubble's collapse could trigger broader economic problems that extend far beyond Wall Street losses. By continuing through this analysis, you've gained insight into the immediate warning signs that bubble conditions are creating throughout the financial system. You now see how record stock valuations are creating systemic risks that could trigger economic problems extending far beyond market losses. Professional fund managers began quietly reducing AI stock exposure while publicly maintaining optimistic rhetoric. This creates the dangerous dynamic where smart money exits while retail investors continue buying, setting up conditions for devastating losses when sentiment shifts. Corporate executives started timing stock sales to take advantage of bubble valuations before they collapse. When company insiders are selling into market euphoria, it suggests that even people with inside information don't believe current prices are sustainable. You've now witnessed how bubble psychology creates conditions that make market corrections more likely while making their economic impact more severe. But what you're about to discover is how this AI bubble's collapse could reshape technology investing for years. Having followed this analysis to its conclusion, you now understand what market strategists like Hartnett are warning about. This isn't just another market cycle, that will resolve with modest corrections. You've gained insight into how AI bubble valuations could trigger changes that reshape technology investing permanently. The AI bubble's eventual collapse will likely create lasting skepticism about technology investing that could limit funding for legitimate innovation while punishing investors who believed that this time was different. Every bubble's bursting creates scars that influence investor behavior for decades. Technology companies will struggle to attract investment for years after AI bubble expectations prove impossible to meet. The transition from bubble euphoria to post-bubble skepticism typically overcorrects, making it difficult for even legitimate companies to achieve reasonable valuations. You now possess complete understanding of how AI euphoria has created bubble conditions that make major market correction almost inevitable. Hartnett's warning that it better be different this time reflects the reality that current valuations only make sense if AI companies can achieve impossible growth rates forever. The next phase will likely see increasing volatility as reality slowly contradicts bubble expectations, with smart money continuing to position for correction while retail investors chase momentum until the inevitable reversal destroys portfolios permanently. The next big story that you missed today is how 61% of economists are demanding the Federal Reserve cut interest rates in September, while inflation expectations surge and Trump attacks Fed Chair Jerome Powell, creating an impossible policy trap that could destroy the economy either way. If you caught that opening and stayed, you're already seeing what most financial analysts are missing in their rate cut predictions. You now understand that this isn't just about normal monetary policy. This is about the Federal Reserve facing impossible choices, where every decision could trigger the economic disaster they're trying to prevent. A Reuters poll of 110 economists found that 61% predict the Fed will lower rates by 25 basis points to 4.0% to 4.25% on September 17, up from 53% in July's survey. This represents the first rate cut of the year as economists worry about rising unemployment and slowing job growth that suggest the economy is weakening faster than expected. But here's the terrifying contradiction. While economists demand rate cuts to prevent recession, U.S. inflation is rising again, with more upward pressure expected from Trump's tariffs. Consumer inflation expectations have surged from 2.8% at year-end to 4.9% currently, creating exactly the conditions where rate cuts typically make inflation worse rather than better. Trump has been aggressively attacking Fed Chair Jerome Powell over his reluctance to cut rates, creating political pressure that threatens the Fed's independence just when that independence is most crucial. Powell's term ends in May, and the combination of political attacks and impossible economic choices is creating policy uncertainty at the worst possible time. The job market data supporting rate cut calls is genuinely alarming. U.S. employers added only 73,000 jobs in July, well short of the 115,000 expected, with big downward revisions to previous months suggesting the labor market is weakening much faster than officials realized. But economists at Barclays warned that markets are excessively confident in September cuts because they're misinterpreting both labor market conditions and the Fed's reaction function. The question isn't whether the Fed needs to prevent job declines, but whether cutting rates while inflation expectations surge could make everything worse. You've now grasped how the Fed faces impossible choices between preventing recession and controlling inflation. But what you're about to discover is how this policy dilemma is creating exactly the uncertainty that makes both recession and inflation more likely. By staying with this analysis, you've positioned yourself to understand the accelerating dynamics that are trapping the Federal Reserve between economic disasters. You now see how political pressure, inflation fears, and recession risks are combining to create a policy crisis where every choice leads to catastrophic outcomes. The Fed's dilemma intensified when recent data showed that traditional relationships between employment, inflation, and interest rates have broken down under Trump's trade policies. Normal monetary policy assumes predictable responses to rate changes, but tariff-driven inflation and employment disruption make those relationships unreliable. Morgan Stanley's chief U.S. economist Michael Gapin noted that the Fed would prefer to retain optionality rather than commit to rate cuts that might prove counterproductive. This suggests even Fed supporters recognize that current economic conditions make traditional policy tools potentially dangerous rather than helpful. The political pressure from Trump adds another layer of complexity, as Fed officials must consider whether rate cuts would be seen as capitulation to political demands rather than independent economic judgment. Once central bank independence is questioned, it becomes much harder to maintain credibility that's essential for effective monetary policy. Interest rate futures markets are pricing in near certainty of September cuts, with strong likelihood of additional cuts by year-end. But this market confidence could actually make the Fed's job harder by creating expectations that become self-fulfilling prophecies regardless of economic fundamentals. Nearly 80% of economists expect tariff inflation inflation impacts to be temporary. But this assumes that current trade policies won't escalate further and that inflation expectations don't become entrenched. Both assumptions look increasingly questionable as Trump's trade war expands and consumer inflation expectations surge. You've now uncovered how the Fed is trapped between recession and inflation risks that make every policy choice potentially catastrophic. But what happened next revealed that this impossible situation is creating exactly the market instability that monetary policy is supposed to prevent. Having stayed committed to understanding this story completely, you've earned access to the explosive details that Fed officials are only now beginning to process. You can finally see what others missed: the exact moment when monetary policy became a trap where every decision could trigger the economic crisis officials are trying to avoid. The crisis peaked when Fed officials realized that rate cuts to prevent recession could accelerate the inflation expectation surge that's already making recession more likely through different channels. When consumers expect 4.9% inflation instead of 2%, they change spending and saving behavior in ways that can cause both inflation and recession simultaneously. The impossible choice became clear when economists demanding rate cuts to support employment had to acknowledge that those same cuts could validate inflation fears and make price stability impossible to achieve. This creates the stagflation scenario that destroyed economies in the 1970s when the Fed faced similar impossible choices. Trump's political attacks on Powell created additional pressure as Fed officials had to consider whether policy decisions would be seen as independent economic judgment or political capitulation. Once central bank credibility is questioned, monetary policy becomes less effective regardless of what rates are set. But the most shocking revelation was how the breakdown of traditional economic relationships under trade war conditions made standard Fed models unreliable for predicting policy outcomes. When tariffs disrupt normal inflation and employment patterns, rate cuts could have effects opposite to what historical experience suggests. Market expectations for rate cuts created their own momentum as traders positioned for cuts that might not happen or might not work as expected. This expectation spiral makes Fed decisions more difficult while creating volatility that damages the economic stability monetary policy is supposed to provide. The August jobs data will likely determine Fed actions, but officials face the terrifying reality that weak employment could justify rate cuts that accelerate inflation expectations and make recession more rather than less likely through psychological channels that traditional models don't capture. You now understand how the Fed faces policy choices where preventing one economic disaster could trigger another. But what you're about to learn is how this monetary policy trap is creating long-term damage to Fed credibility and economic stability. By continuing through this analysis, you've gained insight into the immediate crisis that Fed officials are struggling to navigate. You now see how impossible policy choices are creating exactly the uncertainty and market instability that effective monetary policy is supposed to prevent. Fed officials began emergency consultations to understand how traditional policy tools might backfire under current conditions, where inflation expectations and recession fears coexist in ways that make standard responses potentially counterproductive. Financial markets started pricing in policy uncertainty as traders recognized that Fed decisions could trigger rather than prevent economic problems. When monetary policy becomes unreliable, it creates additional sources of market volatility that compound existing economic stress. Corporate executives began adjusting business plans based on assumptions that Fed policy would become increasingly unpredictable as political pressure and impossible economic choices made traditional monetary policy frameworks obsolete. International central banks expressed concern about U.S. monetary policy uncertainty and its potential impact on global financial stability. When the world's most important central bank faces impossible choices, it creates systemic risks that extend far beyond American borders. You've now witnessed how monetary policy can become a source of economic instability rather than stability when political pressure combines with impossible economic choices. But what you're about to discover is how this Fed crisis is creating permanent changes to central banking credibility. Having followed this analysis to its conclusion, you now understand what monetary policy experts are only beginning to recognize: this isn't a temporary difficult period that will resolve with better economic data. You've gained insight into how political pressure and impossible economic choices can permanently damage central bank effectiveness. The Fed's credibility faces long-term damage as officials are forced to choose between recession and inflation in ways that make traditional monetary policy frameworks obsolete. Once markets lose confidence in central bank ability to manage economic stability, it becomes much harder to achieve that stability regardless of what policies are chosen. Future Fed chairs will inherit an institution whose independence has been questioned and whose policy tools have been proven inadequate for managing trade war-induced economic disruption. This creates permanent constraints on monetary policy effectiveness that could persist for decades. threats. International central banks are studying Fed difficulties as evidence of how political pressure can destroy monetary policy effectiveness. This could encourage other countries to reduce reliance on dollar-based financial systems and Fed policy coordination. You now possess complete understanding of how the Federal Reserve faces impossible choices between recession and inflation that could destroy economic stability regardless of what decisions are made. The combination of political pressure, impossible economic conditions, and broken traditional relationships has created a monetary policy trap with no good solutions. The next phase will likely see continued Fed struggles with impossible choices, while markets lose confidence in monetary policy effectiveness, creating additional sources of economic instability that make recession more likely, regardless of what interest rates are set. The next big story that you missed today is how Google, Amazon, and Microsoft are desperately lobbying the Treasury Department to keep renewable energy subsidies after Trump's policies threaten to kill 60 gigawatts of solar capacity that powers the AI revolution. If you caught that opening and stayed, you're already seeing what most tech analysts missed in the subsidy lobbying news. You now understand that this isn't just about tax credits. This is about the AI industry facing an existential energy crisis that could kill the entire artificial intelligence boom. The Data Center Coalition, representing Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, just sent an urgent letter to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, warning that tougher rules on renewable energy tax credits could directly impact our ability to meet AI-era electricity demands tomorrow. This isn't typical lobbying. This is panic from companies realizing their business model depends on energy subsidies they might lose. Trump's July executive order directed Treasury to tighten clean energy tax credit rules. Clean Energy Associates projects the U.S. could lose 60 gigawatts of planned solar capacity through 2030 if stricter rules are implemented. That's enough to power 45 million homes and represents the renewable energy infrastructure supposed to power AI data centers. Between 2017 and 2023, the data center industry contributed $3.5 trillion to GDP and employed over 600,000 workers. But all that growth assumed cheap renewable energy would power increasingly energy-hungry AI operations that require massive computational resources. Treasury is expected to issue updated guidelines as soon as August 18th, creating a deadline that has tech executives scrambling to preserve subsidies that make their AI strategies economically viable. You've now grasped how the AI boom depends entirely on energy subsidies Trump wants to eliminate. But what you're about to discover is how this energy crisis could kill the AI revolution and crash tech stocks valued on artificial intelligence growth assumptions. By staying with this analysis, you've positioned yourself to understand the accelerating dynamics that caught the tech industry unprepared. You now see how renewable energy policy is becoming the bottleneck that could destroy AI investment and trigger a tech stock collapse. Tech companies built AI strategies around assumptions that cheap renewable energy would be available through government subsidies. Without these subsidies, renewable projects become uneconomical, forcing companies to rely on expensive traditional power that makes AI operations financially unsustainable. The 60-gigawatt loss represents collapse of the renewable energy infrastructure supposed to support AI expansion. This could force fundamental revisions to AI investment plans that stock markets have been pricing for massive growth. Corporate AI strategies that assumed unlimited cheap energy are facing reality checks as energy availability, not computing power, may become the limiting factor for artificial intelligence growth. You've now uncovered how renewable energy policy has become the hidden constraint that could kill the AI boom. But what happened next revealed that tech companies are facing an energy crisis that makes their current stock valuations impossible to justify. Having stayed committed to understanding this story completely, you've earned access to the explosive details that tech investors are completely missing. You can finally see what others can't, the moment when energy policy became an existential threat to the AI revolution, driving trillion-dollar stock valuations. The crisis peaked when tech executives realized Trump's subsidy elimination could make their entire AI strategy economically impossible. Without cheap renewable energy, the computational costs of running AI operations become so high that most applications can't generate sufficient revenue to justify their energy consumption. The August 18th Treasury deadline created panic as companies recognized they had days to preserve subsidies that make AI economics work. This isn't gradual policy adjustment, this is potential immediate elimination of energy infrastructure the entire AI boom depends on. The most shocking revelation was how completely dependent the AI revolution had become on government subsidies that most investors didn't know existed. Tech stock valuations assume AI will generate massive profits, but those profits require energy costs only possible through taxpayer-subsidized renewable power. Stock market implications became apparent as investors began questioning whether AI valuations make sense if energy costs make most AI applications unprofitable. When AI economics depend on subsidies that might disappear, it suggests AI stock prices are built on foundations that could collapse overnight. You now understand how energy policy has become the hidden factor that could destroy AI economics and crash tech stocks. But what you're about to learn is how this energy crisis could reshape the entire technology industry and American economic competitiveness. By continuing through this analysis, you've gained insight into the immediate crisis responses that tech companies are scrambling to implement. You now see how energy subsidy elimination could trigger changes throughout the technology industry that extend far beyond individual company profits. Tech executives began emergency strategy reviews to understand how AI plans would change if renewable energy subsidies disappear. Companies that built business models around artificial intelligence are discovering that energy costs could make those models economically impossible. Data center developers started delaying construction projects as renewable energy availability became uncertain. This creates feedback loops where AI expansion plans become questionable. Just as companies need more computational capacity to compete, investment firms began reassessing tech stock valuations based on scenarios where AI operations become economically unviable due to energy costs. When fundamental assumptions about AI profitability change, it forces recalculation of stock prices driven by artificial intelligence optimism. You've now witnessed how energy policy can threaten entire industries built around assumptions of abundant cheap power. But what you're about to discover is how this crisis could permanently alter American technology leadership. Having followed this analysis to its conclusion, you now understand what tech executives are only beginning to recognize: this isn't a temporary policy challenge that will resolve with lobbying. You've gained insight into how energy constraints could permanently reshape the AI industry and American technological competitiveness. The potential loss of 60 gigawatts of renewable capacity represents permanent infrastructure that won't be built, creating energy constraints that could limit AI development for decades. Once renewable projects are canceled, they typically aren't revived quickly, making energy availability a long-term constraint on technological growth. Tech companies face fundamental decisions about whether to continue AI investment if energy costs make most applications unprofitable. This could force industry-wide shifts away from energy-intensive artificial intelligence toward more efficient computing approaches. International AI competition could be decided by energy policy as countries with cheap renewable energy gain permanent advantages. If American tech companies face energy constraints while Chinese competitors don't, it could determine global artificial intelligence leadership for generations. You now possess complete understanding of how renewable energy policy has become the hidden constraint that could kill the AI revolution and reshape global technological competitiveness. The urgent lobbying by Google, Amazon, and Microsoft reveals how dependent the entire artificial intelligence boom has become on government subsidies that most investors don't realize are essential for AI economics. The next phase will likely see continued tech industry pressure to preserve energy subsidies while investors begin questioning whether AI valuations make sense if energy constraints make artificial intelligence applications economically unviable. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.